Over to Georgia now, where residents are on alert over concerns about toxic groundwater. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution is reporting that recent tests of groundwater around 3 Air Force bases in that state have all come back showing extensive environmental contamination. Much of this contamination came from a firefighting foam used by the Air Force over the last few decades. Now, despite the test results, the Air Force says Georgia's drinking water is safe for residents. Experts, though, refute that claim, saying that the foam risks exposing residents to chemicals linked to cancer and more. One professor points out, quote, given that there are concentrations of these compounds on site, over time, they're going to move off the site. That's just common sense. No contaminant obeys property lines. So to discuss this, I was joined earlier today by investigative journalist Ben Swann for his thoughts. Experts and residents are arguing that the military's review of this tainted water was too narrow and failed to test water off base for contamination. Should residents think twice before taking advice from the military, given the all clear to drink this water?
Yeah, I think they absolutely should be very cautious about this. A couple of very important points, and you raised one of them right there, which is that the Air Force did not test water off base. So none of the homes in the area, none of the municipalities that surround these Air Force bases have had their water tested. And that's a huge concern. Now, there's 3 different Air Force bases we're talking about. We're talking about Robins Air Force Base, Dobbins Air Force Base, and Moody Air Force Base. So the difference between these in terms of geography is pretty significant. Dobbins, for instance, is right, actually just a few miles from where I'm sitting right now, and it's a pretty concentrated metropolitan area. But if you go out to someplace like Moody, which is down in the southern part of Georgia, it's very rural. And so when the military says, well, we tested the water, the Air Force says they tested it, the wells at Moody go down some 400 feet, but the wells for most people in the area go down about 200 feet. So while the groundwater may not be contaminated for the Air Force Base, does not mean that the water is not contaminated for those private homes or for the rivers and lakes and streams in the area.
Now, Ben, the Air Force said in a statement that its response is constrained by a lack of regulation for these so-called PFAS chemicals. That's a class of chemicals known, let me see if I can get this name right for you, polyfluoroalkyl substances. The statement reads this, because PFOS and PFOAs are unregulated and Georgia or federal entities have not established standards for non-drinking water sources, we cannot expand government resources on those water sources. What do you make of that conclusion? A little suspicious?
I think most people would think it was extremely suspicious. By the way, good job on pronouncing the name. I'm not even going to try it. But look, when you say because of federal law, we can't really test these areas. Here's what we know about these chemicals. We know that these chemicals lead to cancer. They lead to problems for children in terms of immune disorders. We know that they lead to kidney disease. There are very severe consequences. And the other thing that's important about these chemicals is that they do not break down over time. They remain concentrated and they don't dissipate into the environment. And so this is a very serious issue in terms of the health risk associated with it. And to say, well, we can't really test because the law is not compelling us. There is not a law that forces us to do this. I think most people would just shake their heads at that and say that makes no sense at all.
Now, I'm glad you brought that up because according to this report, Moody Air Force Base recorded the highest levels of groundwater contamination out of those 3 there in Georgia where you're at. More than 5,000 times the screening level. What responsibility does the government bear here?
Well, I think the government knows that it bears a huge responsibility. If you go back into May of this year, there was the EPA study that was starting to look at this. And by the way, Georgia's not alone in this. There's 3 Air Force bases affected by it, but there's about 126 bases across the country, military bases, that have this same problem. And so this is really a national issue in terms of where it's hitting. But when there was discussion about how to release this information, actually the EPA started to push back, and White House aides were saying this is going to be a public relations nightmare. So they have really resisted talking about this issue. There's huge culpability here and huge liability in terms of the cleanup that needs to take place. Again, understand that this is a progressive chemical in that it goes into the water, it affects fish and wildlife, and then eventually passes on to humans, and it affects all of us. So it's a very serious issue. And the Air Force and the DOD needs to get on the stick here and start to work to clean this thing up, rather than pretending that, well, the toxicity levels may not be quite as bad as we thought they were. It turns out they're actually worse.
Real briefly, Ben, do you think this is another Flint water crisis of the South?
I don't know if it will be that bad, because remember, with Flint, the issue was the water, and also had to do with the pipes, and it had to do with water flowing into people's homes. Whereas, because this is more affecting groundwater, well water, perhaps fishing, I don't think we'll see the same kind of response that we saw with Flint, where it's a much more concentrated group of people. This is more rural, so it's more spread out.
All right, as always, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, Ben Swann.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.